the history lesson that Democrats took from this, and certainly Biden is old enough himself to remember all this, is that you don't do primary challenges to the incumbents because you're probably not going to get a better candidate. The challenger is going to lose, but they're going to road test all of this material that the general election opponent is going to then use against you, and it just produces a weaker candidate for you in the fall. So they didn't want to do that. And then the debate between Biden and Trump made them decide, I think, that they wanted a little bit of a do-over on that.
Welcome to The Debrief, where we talk with the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the headlines they're covering and where the story's going next. I'm Sarah Bedford, and I'm here with Magazine Editor Jim Antle. And Jim, you have written in a piece for the Examiner this past week about how there's some tension between the fact that the Democratic National Convention was themed around this idea of generational change, passing the torch, and yet the headliners for basically every night were people from the past who hit their high water mark of popularity a decade or more ago.
Sure.
So tell us about that.
So it's an interesting dynamic because the whole point of this convention ostensibly has been to shove Joe Biden off the stage, present Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, and Walz looks a bit long in the tooth himself, but to present them as new, as sort of the change candidates, and trying to reset the whole narrative of the campaign, which had been sort of this joyless, to use an overworked word, slog between two sort of older candidates who the voters were very familiar with, not super enamored of, in which the Republicans were slightly favored because former President Trump is a bit more with it than President Biden. And so they're trying to flip the whole script on that now with a somewhat younger ticket. And Harris obviously looks even younger than she is. So she's brought a certain energy to the race that had been lacking before. But it's true that the headliners of the convention have been all older. We've seen both Clintons, both Obamas, Nancy Pelosi. Obviously, there was always going to be a bit of a swan song for Biden. He is still, believe it or not, the sitting president. So that
easy to forget.
Easy to forget. Perhaps he sometimes forgets it himself. but you know, that was to be expected. But the rest of this does seem a little off message, especially now that they have all of these young governors, many of them once on Harris's VP shortlist that they could showcase after all of these years where the Democratic bench was so limited because of midterm election losses. But the other, to me, interesting aspect of this is the role that Pelosi and Obama played in sort of ushering in this change after they had supposedly handed the baton to other people. Well, Pelosi was the first aspect of the generational change in the Democratic Party for leadership, ostensibly, because she led the charge in having the octogenarian House Democratic leadership team all basically step down and be replaced by younger people. But Pelosi, no longer wielding the Speaker's gavel, does seem to be more powerful than a lot of the current Democratic leadership, including the sitting president. And though at least she is still elected by the people in her district, unlike Obama, who is no longer had been voted for by anybody, who still seems to be really calling the shots here.
You talked about how there are new Democratic stars in the party. They're governors, Governor Gavin Newsom, Gretchen Whitmer, others who aren't being given this sort of attention in this, you know, hope and change convention that Democrats are trying to have. Right. Do you think that reflects something bad about the trajectory of the Democratic Party, that the new stars aren't perceived as having enough broad appeal beyond the left to carry a convention that's supposed to be reaching out to the electorate?
There's probably something to that. You know, people make fun of Republicans for still talking about Ronald Reagan 40 years later, but the fact is Democrats have always done this kind of stuff. They've always venerated their past presidents and past political leaders. A lot of Democrats had pictures of FDR and JFK and Harry Truman on their mantles decades after these people, in many cases, were no longer even alive. So Democrats have always had sort of, despite their forward-lookingness and their appeal to youth, had a certain nostalgia for their political leadership. I also suspect there's an element of the rivalry that Harris may have with some of these people, with some of these governors. Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania, was reportedly not picked not just because of Israel, but also because he seemed to have his own presidential ambitions. And the precedent they've created here by sort of shoving Biden aside is that if Harris is elected but not very popular, maybe some of these governors do look at a primary challenge in 2028. And if they don't, it'll be a long way for somebody like Gavin Newsom, who clearly was thinking about a presidential run if Biden didn't run himself. These people have to wait a long time. So maybe the precedent they've created would mean that if Harris looks like a beatable person, even though she's an incumbent, you take a serious look at it.
That's a really interesting point. We've not seen in our lifetimes a presidential nominee not, go through a primary process, and we've not seen an incumbent president who was intending to seek re-election bowed out under pressure like this.
Right.
Does this set a precedent for both parties going forward, where we might start seeing in the modern era challenges to incumbent presidents that are serious? They're usually just gimmicks.
Sure. I mean, the whole reason Democrats didn't want to have a competitive primary process against Biden is because the recent history of those challenges, which are now not so recent, certainly none of them in your lifetime, but is that they've tended to fail but weaken the incumbent. So when you look at, say, the pushing out Lyndon Johnson with Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy, Hubert Humphrey won the nomination, but he lost the presidency to Richard Nixon. Ronald Reagan challenged Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford won the nomination, lost his re-election, or his sole election. Pat Buchanan challenged George H.W. Bush, didn't win the nomination. Bush lost his election. Ted Kennedy and Jimmy Carter.
How do you know all these facts in your head?
1980.
That's very impressive.
Age, it's a wonderful thing. It's the only good thing about it, in fact. But
the encyclopedic knowledge.
So the feeling based on this history, now it is a bit of a chicken or egg thing. Did all of these people attract primary challengers in the first place because they were weak incumbents with lots of problems going on? But the history lesson that Democrats took from this, and certainly Biden is old enough himself to remember all this, is that you don't do primary challenges to the incumbents because you're probably not going to get a better candidate. The challenger is going to lose, but they're going to road test all of this material that the general election opponent is going to then use against you, and it just produces a weaker candidate for you in the fall. So they didn't want to do that. And then the debate between Biden and Trump made them decide, I think, that they wanted a little bit of a do-over on that. Not enough of a do-over to have an actual contested convention, but to hand really the nomination to Harris, but a do-over on the idea that, okay, maybe we do need to kind of move on from Biden because he doesn't look like he's going to win the general election.
Well, Jim, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
You can get more writing from Jim and the rest of the political team at washingtonexaminer.com.